You've heard of their honor, their discipline, their blade. But what if the truth was far darker? What if becoming a samurai meant surrendering your name, your choices, your future, and being applauded only when you bled? This wasn't nobility, it was a descent into submission, pain, and extinction. To the outside world, becoming a samurai was the ultimate achievement, a symbol of power, a badge of elite warrior status. Your family was proud, your clan held you high. You were supposed to be the best of the best, disciplined, fearless, and honored. But that's only the surface. Beneath the lacquered armor and the graceful bows was a life shaped by pain. The samurai didn't just train, they were conditioned, molded, owned. Every move was dictated, every word was monitored, and every breath borrowed from your lord. Becoming a samurai wasn't a calling, it was a contract. One signed in blood, bound by silence, and sealed with the promise of ritualized death should you ever dishonor it. So today, we're not telling you the version sung in poems or painted in cherry blossom scenes. We're cutting through the legend with the same blade they were forced to master. Because the truth? Becoming a samurai wasn't the beginning of a noble journey. It was the start of a life that demanded everything and gave nothing back but scars. This isn't just a history lesson. It's an unmasking, a reckoning. And what you'll see beneath the helmet may haunt you more than any battlefield. Death was not feared, it was practiced. Samurai didn't just accept death, they rehearsed it. From the moment they could walk, they were taught not to run from death, but to study it, to bow to it, and eventually, to master it. It wasn't just a part of life, it was the point of it. Every training session, mental exercise, and story they were told pointed in one direction, toward the grave. They were made to visualize their own death daily. Not abstractly, vaguely, but vividly. Where it would happen, how it would feel, how they would breathe, bleed, and bow as life slipped away. It was spiritual conditioning, mental hardening, an emotional exile from fear. And then there was seppuku, ritual suicide, a slow, deliberate act of slicing open your own stomach with a small blade, not in a moment of madness, but in complete control, in front of witnesses, with poise, with purpose. This wasn't punishment, it wasn't shameful, it was beautiful. An art form of suffering turned into theater, the ultimate proof of honor. Samurai children didn't hear bedtime tales of growing old or building happy homes. They were raised on legends of warriors who died gracefully, who smiled as they disemboweled themselves to protect a name, a lord, or an ideal. Death was not a shadow to be avoided, it was a spotlight to be earned. Because nothing says well-adjusted childhood like planning your own death before you lose your baby teeth. Teachers would observe how a child responded to pain. If he flinched too much, if he cried too long. The goal wasn't to raise survivors. It was to craft men who could meet death with such calm that even their enemies would marvel. Some even fantasized about their final moment, planned it like a wedding. The clothes they would wear, the words they would say, the weapon they would choose. Because to die well was to win immortality in the stories that would be told afterward. And this wasn't bravery in the way we define it today. It wasn't the absence of fear, it was the total rejection of life's pleasures for the sake of perfect control. Even death, the ultimate unknown, had to be mastered. Or you weren't worthy of the blade you carried. But even if you perfected the art of dying, you still had to survive. And surviving as a samurai? That meant starving with pride and pretending it was noble. Samurai were always broke and proud of it. The image of a powerful, privileged samurai collapses the moment you follow the money. Because behind the polished armor and disciplined silence was a man often too broke to buy new sandals. Most samurai weren't rich. They weren't living in castles or swimming in gold. Their income came in rice, not coins, measured out in stipends by their feudal lord. Controlled, fixed, often delayed, and almost never enough. The rice was meant to feed their families, maintain their weapons, repair their armor, and bribe the right officials when necessary. Stretching it that far was nearly impossible, so while they stood tall in public behind closed doors, they rationed bowls of thin gruel and patched their robes until they barely held together. Unlike merchants or farmers, samurai weren't allowed to work. Farming was beneath them. Trade was dishonorable. Earning a living, unthinkable. Starving quietly? Now that's character. Money itself was seen as something dirty, a temptation that would stain the soul of a warrior. They were supposed to live purely, fueled only by loyalty and discipline. Pride and poverty became part of the image, a badge of moral superiority. You weren't just poor, you were noble in your suffering. But poverty doesn't care about pride. Debts piled up, families went hungry, children wore the same robes year after year until the seams gave out. Samurai would often sell personal heirlooms in secret, ancient blades passed down for generations. Family scrolls, pieces of armor, all sacrificed in the quiet desperation of keeping up appearances, and still they were expected to remain silent. No complaints, no visible cracks. Their duty was to appear unshaken, to starve with poise, to suffer with elegance. Because to admit hardship was to admit weakness, and weakness had no place in a warrior's world. Some took loans from merchants they were trained to look down upon. Others took side work under aliases. A few abandoned the code entirely, choosing survival over tradition. But even then, their shame followed them. They weren't just broke, they were broken by the lie that honor alone could feed a family. This wasn't the romantic poverty of poetry. This was financial collapse dressed up as discipline. And all that hardship, all that hunger and loyalty, it wasn't leading to glory on the battlefield. Because here's the final irony. Most samurai never fought at all. Still watching? Then ask yourself this. Would you join a society that demanded you kill yourself beautifully rather than live imperfectly? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more brutal truths from history. Bureaucrats with blades most never saw a battle. The romantic image is hard to shake. The lone samurai standing under moonlight, blade drawn, locked in a noble duel for honor or vengeance. But most samurai never saw a battlefield, never heard the scream of war, never spilled a single drop of enemy blood. Especially during the long peace of the Edo period, the age of the warrior shifted into something else entirely. The fighting stopped, but the warriors remained. And with no battles to fight, they were quietly reassigned. Accountants, couriers, legal scribes, temple guards, record keepers. That's what most samurai became. Not killers, not heroes, functionaries. Their swords still hung from their waists, polished and precise, but they were more ceremonial than functional. A symbol, not a weapon. A reminder of a past that no longer existed. The dojos didn't vanish, but they changed. Training halls became community centers. Sword drills were still taught, but with more attention to posture than survival. Young men bowed, recited rules, practiced forms, but it was theater. Controlled. Clean, safe. There was no enemy charging toward them, no real fear, no blood on the mats. Only tradition maintained like a well-rehearsed play. And yet they still wore their armor in public, still recited the code, still expected respect from peasants who now earned more money and lived freer lives. Some adapted, others faked it. But deep down, many samurai felt the contradiction harden inside them. Warriors in name, not in reality. They were bound to a title that no longer had a purpose, raised to fight in a world that no longer wanted fighters. The Bushido code remained, but its teeth were gone. Loyalty meant showing up to meetings. Honor meant filling out reports correctly. Duty meant staying quiet while the world moved on without you. Many spent their entire lives waiting for a war that never came. They read old battle texts, They kept their blades sharp, they prepared. But the call to action never arrived. Instead, they shuffled paperwork, enforced curfews, filed legal petitions. They weren't warriors anymore. They were bureaucrats filing reports in full battle regalia, because nothing says deadly like a tax audit with a sword on your hip. And for a group raised to see glory in combat, nothing was more humiliating than surviving long enough to become irrelevant. But if they weren't fighting wars, what were they doing? They were serving something far stricter than any sword fight. They were serving Bushido, the invisible master that ruled every breath they took. Bushido, the beautiful prison. Bushido was sold as a compass, a righteous path, a way to live with honor, courage, and discipline. But behind the poetry and the proverbs was something colder, stricter, a system not designed to uplift but to contain. It promised purpose, meaning, glory. But in practice, it demanded silence, obedience, erasure. The code wasn't gentle, it wasn't wise, it was absolute. It told samurai how to think, how to feel, how to die, and above all, it told them never to question. Loyalty was sacred, not to ideas or values, but to a person, a master, a lord, even if he was cruel, even if he was wrong. A samurai's duty was not to morality, it was to hierarchy. Emotion was seen as a weakness. Grief was undignified, joy was suspicious. A samurai was expected to remain composed even in the face of tragedy, betrayal, or personal ruin. Desire was a threat. Ambition outside of service was a sin. Romantic love was tolerated barely. Passion for anything beyond the sword or one's superior was quietly condemned. There was no room for self. You didn't just follow the rules, you became them. You didn't live your truth. You buried it beneath layers of ritual and restraint. The code glorified death, not just in battle, but as an escape from shame. A samurai who stumbled, who failed, who hesitated, was expected to kill himself with dignity. Seppuku wasn't a last resort, it was a built-in feature. A way to maintain honor by destroying the self. One mistake, one rumor, one slight misstep in decorum, and your entire lineage could carry the stain. Miss a bow, lose your bowels. That kind of pressure doesn't create noble men. It creates fragile shells. Performers trapped in roles too strict to breathe inside. Bushido wasn't guidance, it was control. A cage built from virtue, it gave purpose, but only the kind that served power. It demanded perfection but never defined it. It promised peace, but only if you surrendered everything that made you human. And the cruelest part? The more perfectly you followed it, the more invisible you became. A tool, symbol, and a shadow of your own potential. You weren't living, you were functioning quietly, precisely, until your usefulness expired and your death became another line in a scroll about loyalty. And if you think that code only governed war and loyalty, think again. Bushido didn't stop at the battlefield. It invaded the bedroom. It rewrote love. It redefined marriage. And it made sure no heart was ever truly free. No room for love. Samurai didn't marry for love. They married for power, for rank, for obligation. Romance had no place in the arrangement. Emotions were not consulted, only bloodlines, status, and political necessity. Marriages were orchestrated by families, lords, or clan elders, carefully negotiated like treaties. Every union was a transaction designed to preserve alliances, secure loyalty, and avoid scandal. The bride and groom might barely know each other. Their personal feelings didn't matter. They were chess pieces, moved by forces far above them. Emotional connection was optional, rare, often discouraged. Wives weren't chosen for affection. They were chosen for their lineage, their connections, their ability to maintain a household with efficiency and silence. Once married, women were expected to stay in the background, out of sight, composed, devoted. They managed the home, raised the children, and preserved the family name without complaint. Many samurai took mistresses, some openly, others in quiet discretion. Passion was permitted, but only if it was controlled and hidden. Love, when it appeared, was often found outside the marriage. But even then it was suppressed. Public displays of affection were scandalous. Private attachments were considered distractions. Because affection made you vulnerable. Attachment made you careless. Can't get heartbroken if you never had a heart. A samurai's duty came first, always. Even in his own home, he was expected to uphold the same discipline he showed on the battlefield. Household life was orderly, restrained, formal. Conversations followed hierarchy. Roles were rigid. Sons were raised with the same emotional distance their fathers had learned. Daughters were prepared to repeat the cycle in another family, another bargain. And hovering over it all, even in the bedroom, even at the dinner table, was the weight of the code. Bushido didn't stop at the threshold. It ruled every glance, every gesture, every word. A samurai might survive war, but his personal life was no refuge. There was no space for messy love or open-hearted joy. Marriage wasn't a sanctuary, it was a structure. Love was a luxury the code couldn't afford. And those who craved it had to hide it, bury it, or cut it away like a weakness. Even at home, the sword never left the room. But while emotions were locked away, power was let loose. Because behind the calm faces and ceremonial bows was a terrifying privilege. The legal right to kill without consequence. Kill first, justify later. Samurai had legal immunity. In a society obsessed with honor, power was not just given to samurai, it was weaponized. One law made it terrifyingly clear. Kirasute Gomen, the right to kill on the spot, no judgment, no trial, no warning, just steal. Under this law, any samurai could strike down a member of a lower class for an act of disrespect. No paperwork, no explanation. A peasant who failed to bow deeply enough could be executed where he stood. A merchant who spoke too freely, a servant who hesitated too long, even a sideways glance could be interpreted as insolence. This wasn't rare, it wasn't theoretical, it was a real and present danger. For the lower classes, every interaction with a samurai was a test of posture, of wording, of breath control. Say too much and you died. Say too little and you died. It gave the samurai unchecked power, turning warriors into walking verdicts, executioners in silk robes. And with each killing done in the name of honor, something deeper began to rot. Because you can't kill indiscriminately and remain righteous. You can't justify murder and keep your soul intact. Samurai who lived by this law weren't just enforcing silence, they were participating in a system that slowly ate away at their morality. This was death in disguise. Not physical, not immediate, but moral death. The slow extinction of conscience dressed up in ceremonial authority, and they were told they were protecting tradition, but what they were really doing was enforcing fear. The streets were quiet, yes, but not out of respect. They were quiet because no one dared to speak. Even in peace, the samurai lived in tension, watched by others, feared by many, respected by few. They walked alone through towns where every bowed head masked quiet hatred. This wasn't leadership. It was social isolation, a kind of exile with armor on. And for the samurai themselves, that power came with a price, living under the pressure to be infallible. Always alert, always restrained, always ready to justify a killing with a calm face and the right ritual. That's not a life, that's psychological suffocation. The more they obeyed the code, the more it consumed them. Kirasute Gomen wasn't just a legal right, it was a trap, a sharpened mask. Behind every execution was another crack in the illusion of honor, another step toward becoming a shell, feared by the people, ruled by duty, empty on the inside. And so yes, the samurai lived. They walked, breathed, and enforced the law. But piece by piece, their empathy, their connection, their inner peace all died quietly behind the armor. Because when your sword becomes your identity, you don't just kill others. You lose yourself with every cut. And if you thought losing your moral compass was enough, wait until you lose your name. Because even your identity, your very sense of self, was just another thing they could take. You couldn't even pick your own name. A samurai's name wasn't his own. It was a title, a tool, a signal of ownership. Clans, lords, and superiors had the power to give it, take it, reshape it at will. Sometimes a name change was granted as a mark of favor. Other times it was punishment, a forced rebirth that erased who you were and reminded you exactly who held control. A name was supposed to represent identity, legacy, selfhood. But in the samurai world, it became a leash. Even children weren't spared. When a boy was adopted into a more prestigious house, a common practice among warrior families, his name was stripped away without hesitation. He received a new one, often chosen to reflect the honor of the family he now served, not the life he came from. This wasn't a gift. It was assimilation, a way of saying, "You belong to us now." Names were changed when lords changed, when alliances shifted, when roles were reassigned. You could wake up one morning a warrior and go to bed a stranger to your own lineage, and you had no say. This wasn't just formality, it was psychological warfare. Who you were was dictated, controlled, curated by authority, and in a society that already demanded silence, obedience, and sacrifice, the loss of a name was the final blow. It made sure you understood. You didn't just serve the system, you were built by it, and you would disappear inside it quietly, without resistance. Because even your name, the most basic piece of identity, was never truly yours. But even if you endured all of that, the obedience, the poverty, the silence, surely there was peace waiting at the end. Not quite. For a samurai, retirement wasn't rest, it was disappearance. Even retirement was a trap. You might think surviving battle would earn a samurai peace, that a long life of service, loyalty, and discipline would be rewarded with rest. But for the samurai, retirement wasn't a reward. It was a quiet humiliation. To step away from duty was to step away from identity. The role consumed them so completely that letting go wasn't freedom, it was erasure. Retirement was viewed with suspicion, not as a natural phase of life, but as a weakness. To age was to fail. To grow tired was to admit you could no longer serve. And for a samurai, not serving meant not existing. There were no parades, no pensions, no honored councils. Instead, some were nudged toward seppuku as a final honorable exit, a way to die usefully rather than live uselessly. Others simply faded, their names forgotten, their years of sacrifice reduced to background noise as new warriors took the stage. Aging wasn't a transition. It was a slow descent into irrelevance. The few who did live into old age often found themselves stripped of the only thing that had given their life structure. No commands to follow, no ranks to uphold, no armor to wear. And beneath the silence, an identity crisis no one spoke of. Because from the start, a samurai's life wasn't his own. Not his thoughts, not his emotions, not even his name. Even children weren't spared. When adopted into a more prestigious family, their names were stripped and replaced, not to elevate them, but to bind them. It looked like an honor. It felt like a promotion, but it was always a leash. A reminder that who you were was never up to you. So by the time a samurai reached old age, what remained? A body worn from training, a mind disciplined into silence, a name that belonged to someone else. No identity, no joy, just the long echo of orders no longer given. In the end, the only retirement that carried prestige wasn't peace, it was death. And preferably not in your sleep, not in your home, but in battle, or by your own hand, violent, public, remembered, because in the samurai world, to live too long was to outlive your worth. And perhaps nothing symbolized that quiet collapse more than the sword itself. Once a feared weapon, now just a beautiful lie strapped to the waist of a forgotten warrior. The sword was mostly for show. By the later centuries, the samurai's most iconic possession, the katana, had lost its purpose. It remained sharp, sacred, revered. But in practice, it was more of a symbol than a weapon. Few samurai actually used it in real combat. Battles had become rare. Violence, bureaucracy. Yet the blade had to be polished daily, stored in specific conditions, passed through rituals before and after training. It was a financial burden, a spiritual obligation, a performance. Crafting a proper katana could cost a fortune. Maintaining one took time, labor, and constant vigilance. You couldn't just own a sword, you had to serve it. But for most samurai, that sword would never taste blood. It would hang on their hip like a badge of identity, a decorative oath. The blade was sharp. The purpose? Not so much. And yet without it, they were incomplete. A samurai without a sword wasn't just unarmed, he was dishonored, disconnected from the myth. So they carried their blades, trained with them, prayed over them, swore their lives to them, then let them gather dust in ceremonial racks. The sword remained deadly, but its purpose had hollowed. It became a burden, a beautiful one. And like much of the samurai life, it looked powerful from the outside, but inside it was quietly empty. They were called warriors, but what they really became were sacrifices. So no, becoming a samurai wasn't a reward, it was a death sentence in disguise. Would you take that oath knowing it ends in silence, not glory? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten truths of history.